I got my Jump Zone cup, holographic one.
Mom, go away. I'm recording a podcast. Recording a podcast.
Welcome back to Verified, everybody. My name is Shane.
My name is Carlos.
Guys, we have an absolutely fantastic interview for you guys today. This is a very new experience for us. We decided to kind of go across the country, and now we have a teenager from California here to talk about her podcast and how she's transferred her experience with mental health into a podcast, and how she plans to use that platform to kind of help others going through similar experiences. Very interestingly, she has interviewed many very notable people. Leo Flowers is a comedian. Audrey Bailey is an artist, and then Blaze Aguirre. I should probably say that again. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and he's a psychiatrist that works at the McLean Hospital. He's like world renowned, a very, very professional dude. Without further ado, please welcome Sadie Sutton from the She Persisted podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I think it's best that we start out with how'd you start She Persisted podcast and why you started it, kind of like your origin story, so to speak.
Yeah, so I went through quite the mental health journey during my 8th grade and freshman year of high school. And when I actually uprooted my entire life and I moved to Boston for about 4 months for mental health treatment, which is crazy, not your typical high school experience. And when I started that really intensive journey, I'd done therapy at home, I'd done different treatments, but I'd never done something where I lived away from home. And so when I started this whole mental health journey, my dad was like, you should podcast this. This would be so cool. So many teens go through these journeys. Imagine how crazy it would be to record every day as you go through this journey. And I hated my parents with every ounce of my being. I thought that they were the root of all my problems. We had a terrible relationship, and I was like, absolutely not. No one's going to listen to it. This is so embarrassing. I'm not going to record this. And I remember we were sitting in the room with my future psychiatrist and therapist, and he was like, "Can I send her a recording device so that she can document this?" And they were like, "No, sir, this is a mental hospital. This is so hip, but you cannot have a recording device in here." So that ship never sailed. And then, a year and a half later, I was still in intensive treatment. I was at a therapeutic boarding school in Montana, and I remembered way early in my journey, around the time I went to Boston during my freshman year, people told me that my life could be different and that I didn't have to suffer from severe depression and severe anxiety and have anything to look forward to, and that my life didn't have to be the way that I was experiencing it. And I didn't believe it. I understood that other people could be happy. I understood that other people could look forward to things or recover from depression, recover from anxiety. And I just didn't think that was in the cards for me because I experienced it from such a young age. And so a year and a half into this super intensive work, and rewiring all my core beliefs, building all of these relationships, I realized that my life and the reality that I was experiencing was exactly what they told me would happen, which was that I looked forward to things. I loved life. I loved my relationships. I had a really healthy relationship with my parents, and I wasn't struggling with depression and anxiety anymore. And so at that point, I was like, okay, if I was this person who never, ever, ever thought I would be happy, I didn't know if I would make it past 18. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew I wasn't going to be happy. And then there I was, able to turn around my life before I'd even left the house. And so that was the moment where I was like, this is definitely something I want to share. I want to give people access to these amazing resources that I've had and share these stories, because teenagers aren't alone when they're struggling with mental health. And you interact with a lot of other people that have struggled with maybe depression at some point, or anxiety, or have had family issues. But as far as teenagers that are saying, hey, I went through this exact same thing that you did and it got better, it is better, and you can do it too, I felt there was a huge lack of that. I heard it from adults, I heard it from doctors, but I didn't hear it from people that were like me. And so podcasting was a really unique platform, and I didn't know a lot of teenagers that consistently released episodes. I knew a lot that did YouTube, or they did Instagram, or they did a blog of sorts. But as far as podcasting, it was still pretty new, and it was unique, and it was a fun skill to learn. So started recording episodes with my friends, and they would tell their stories and experiences, and I would share mine, and I would sit down with my parents, and they would give advice to other parents that had a kid who was struggling. And then I circled back with the doctors that I worked with, and other people, like you mentioned, that were social media personalities, and kind of just further breaking down that barrier that everyone has mental health and everyone has to navigate that.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be something that we don't talk about. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say real quick a side note about like podcasting in general. You mentioned it being like a new thing. A lot of people aren't doing it. I'm actually very excited to see where it's going because
Mhm,
I think it has been around for a long time, but
mhm.
it's just now starting to become a little more popular. Like you hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is my new favorite podcast," right? And you
Yeah.
have people like Joe. I mean, obviously you have like Joe Rogan, who's very notable. A lot of people know
Mhm,
who he is, and he does podcasts. So it's like YouTube has become like new media, right? For
mhm.
just media in general. Like you went from TV, now you have YouTube, um, and now it's like you had radio shows, and now we're having podcasts, which are
Totally. It's a much more
interesting.
personal and intimate experience. Whatever you're looking for, it's there because, like you said, there's millions of podcasts, but it's
Hmm.
so creative that there's all these different niches and it can't be too crowded of a space because everyone's doing something completely different. And
Right.
while there's all these different creators, again, everything is so unique and it's not a completely monetized platform yet. And there's still a lot of
Hmm.
room for it to grow. And the numbers of people that are listening to podcasts are just going up. So I agree for sure.
I'm very excited. That's for sure.
You talked about like the purpose and like the goal that you had when you initially started this podcast. So I was wondering, as you've gained more of a following, as you've interviewed more people, how has your purpose or goal of doing this podcast changed over time?
Yeah, so it's shifted a lot. I think I've had 3 different cover arts for my podcast, which I think that's how it kind of, like, break up these different time periods of the show. And for the longest time, I didn't even tell anyone I had a podcast. I mean, my parents knew, my super close friends knew, but I never announced it on my personal Instagram, I didn't share it with family. It was something I was just trying to find my voice with. And so I started, like I said, with talking to close friends, close family members, and really breaking down my own story and what my suffering looked like from the outside. Because I was someone who was feeling all these intense emotions and struggling a lot, but I hid it and I bottled up and I didn't think that people could help me. And if I thought that if I told people I wasn't okay, that I was even more weak. And that was really accepting that it was real and that it was out of my control and I didn't know what to do. And so I wanted to kind of create this picture of sorts for parents and friends and peers to look at and say, okay, this person's spending a lot more time at home. This person really hasn't been sleeping like they normally were, or they're a lot more isolated. Maybe I can go and support them because something bigger might be going on. So, kind of creating an example of what a teen suffering can look like and what I wish I would have done differently, what my parents wish they would have done differently, and what my peers wish they would have done differently so that other kids didn't have to get to the point that I did. Um, and from that, it kind of shifted to hearing other teen stories. So hearing um, what their journeys with their mental health looked like, whether it was PTSD or depression, anxiety, ADHD, whatever diagnoses they had, whatever they'd worked through, kind of talking about that. And I did a lot of DBT education, which was a type of therapy where it's just kind of skills that teach you how to cope with life, whether it's staying present or tolerating distress, being more interpersonally effective, and regulating your emotions. I started teaching those on the podcast because those skills were literally what saved my life. And so I
Right.
wanted to bring those again to a larger audience. And then it really did shift to becoming me interviewing more people and asking for their tips and tricks and what was helpful for them in their own mental health journeys. And so talking to fellow podcasters about how podcasting impacted their mental health, talking to world-class clinicians about what would they say to parents who don't know what to do, what do you say to a kid who feels like they're really struggling and don't have treatment, and then kind of getting different perspectives, whether it's people that really found hope through a religious perspective, or maybe they tried this really intensive treatment and that was what worked for them. And so, again, still integrating the DBT and doing more Q&A episodes that involve my audience more, but
Hmm.
really just um, furthering the conversation of mental health and speaking from my experience and sharing others' experiences from a very positive angle. So, what were the skills that worked? What are your favorite routines that help your mental health? What are the I don't know. What are the resources that were helpful for you? Because what can separate us so much is those nitty-gritty emotional experiences or the different behaviors you use to cope with what you're feeling, because we all present differently when we struggle with mental health. But those emotions, that sadness or that loneliness or that shame or that anger, all of that kind of stuff, that's what we can relate to no matter where you are on the spectrum of severity of what you're struggling with. So really breaking it down to those core emotions and then focusing it from a positive perspective so that the podcast isn't something that triggers people or that's a negative space or really just um, brings people down further than they already are. So it's a resource for people to go to and learn how to take control of their mental health and hear that they're not alone because we all experience these emotions.
A big thing that I like that you talked about, and I obviously like in a more general sense, is that like kind of how you diversified and you talked about you started doing like more Q&A style, more interviews and things.
I think the Q&As are
whether or not it's a
interesting because
podcast.
it's like it's much easier to do a Q&A episode than it is to completely write an interview from scratch or completely write your own content. And getting people to just send you random questions is difficult. And one of my favorite things to do is post a little box question thing on Instagram and then send it to the 15 closest podcasters that I've interacted with their content. And maybe they feel obligated, maybe they're just nice, but they will ask questions. So you end up with like 15 questions to build an episode off of. And maybe it's not the most organic questions, but it's still authentic questions from a target audience that your audience will resonate with, even if maybe they didn't feel the courage to reach out themselves or they didn't see that one post within 24 hours on your story. And so that's a really effective way to get questions as well.
General things about high school, like about other students putting on like a persona. I struggled with this a lot when I was going into high school about like seeing how people are acting and thinking that's how they actually are and feel. And I kind of hear what you have to say about that. But let's start with like how you started telling people about the podcast and what that experience was like, and then we'll get into the other stuff.
Yeah, so when I think about telling people about the podcast, I think about it people making TikToks. Like TikTok is, if you're a big TikToker, it's awesome. People love you. It's amazing. But if you're doing really bad dances, it's mortifying. It's embarrassing. People laugh about your dances behind your back. Like it's the exact same thing with podcasting or when that person starts a YouTube channel offhandedly and no one watches. So with podcasting, the reason I didn't tell people about the podcast at first was because I was talking about my own mental health. That was a super, super fragile topic and something so vulnerable. I wouldn't have the conversations with people at school that I talk to my listeners about on the podcast, like my lowest points, my very most vulnerable parts of me, like my belief that I didn't deserve love or that I would never be good enough for my parents. Like bringing that up over a calculus homework would just be so odd.
Right.
And so the thought, I actually started a new school a couple months after I started the podcast. So the thought of going into this completely new environment where no one knew me and they would have access to all these personal details about me, like that was terrifying. And I also knew that I wanted the time to figure out how to tell my mental health story in a way that I felt proud of and that I could completely stand behind. And I think that all of our stories are constantly evolving, but especially with mental health, you get better at telling your story in a way that resonates with other people, isn't triggering, it isn't like, whoa, okay, like that's a lot. Like I'm happy you're doing good now, but like this is too much for me. And so I kind of learned how to create that narrative in a way that resonated and that wasn't so overpowering when there wasn't a huge relationship already established. And so people did find out about the podcast. I think I'd put it on my LinkedIn at some point, and that's for some reason what people were looking at during school. And so,
LinkedIn,
or like,
that's
oh,
interesting.
yeah, I know. Yeah,
I don't think we mentioned LinkedIn once in high school. I
Yeah.
definitely don't have an account. That's interesting. Okay, we'll come back.
Should we
We'll
plug,
circle back
should
to
we
that.
plug that? Should we
Plug
plug
the
that as
LinkedIn.
well? Plug your LinkedIn?
oh my God, no, don't go on my LinkedIn.
You guys want to check out Sadie on
Get one.
LinkedIn?
No, but no, get one. Super helpful to kind of like figure out what your resume is. And especially for college applications, a lot of your activity section will come from things you would put on a LinkedIn, whether it's clubs you're in, internships, etc. So make a LinkedIn, helpful tip, but don't share with people because disastrous.
Okay.
So they found this podcast and someone mentioned it and I was like, what? And then they would like play it in front of me, which I don't know if you guys have ever had that experience where someone listens to your podcast in front of you, but it's terrible. Like I love listening. Yeah, I love listening to myself talk. Like, that's why I have a podcast. I love editing. I enjoy the process. I think I say great things. But hearing it
Right.
come out of someone else's phone and
Mm-mm.
like, I'm like, oh no, please stop. And so that's like the worst experience ever. Not like I don't blame other people because like I'm putting this out into the world. Of course,
Right.
I expect people to listen, but just so weird. And so when people found out, I think I'd gotten 2,000 total listens. And right now I'm averaging about 10,000 listens a month. So very different from where I was when they first found out. But I still had not fully created what I wanted with the podcast. I didn't have that audience where I was like, I'm really proud of this. Like this, I'm putting my all into this project. And I don't care who listens because this is my favorite thing about my life right now. And so it was definitely not the most, I didn't really get to choose about that at that point. But then I think a couple months later, after I'd really just dove into my podcast during quarantine, had some interviews out that I felt amazing about and felt really confident about it. I did do an Instagram post and got to control that narrative and share it from my own perspective. And I felt really good about that. And so, yeah, that was kind of how I went about sharing the podcast. What was your second question?
My mom is not caught up. She's like, I need to catch up on my verified. And I literally walked downstairs and it's playing. And I'm like, oh God. Like, it's like I just woke up too. So I'm like going down. Anyway, I don't like it.
No, I don't mind when my parents listen. Like we've gone on, we're not a big road trip family, but during Corona we have a little bit, and so we would go on road trips, and I'd be like, guys, you got to listen to my episode. Like it's so good. So I would beg them. We'd be sitting in the car to listen to the episode, and they'd be fine, we'll listen. And they're like, oh, this is pretty good. Like anyone other than like my parents, I'm like. Well, but now my parents are very behind. My dad was really up to date for a while. He would listen every week. And my mom at first didn't listen at all because this was like, again, my own mental health experience. It was like kind of triggering for her to go back and like revisit all this pain that she saw me be in. And then I released this episode with my friend where we were kind of reminiscing about our experience in treatment from a not so positive light. And my parents were like, this is not okay. And they were both listening. And then they were like, we need to like, we're gonna get sued, like Sadie, this is not good. And I was like, no, it's fine, I promise. So now they've been listening again, but they go in and out of being consistent with the episodes. But yeah,
you said 10,000 monthly listeners.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
The first entire year of podcasting, I think I only got to 1,000 or 2,000 total listens, like ever. And then I think it might have been July or August when I hit 5,000 monthly listens. And then September, I've been on a podcast pause. My parents have instituted we're not going to put out any more episodes until we figure out this suing situation. No one's suing us. Like, there's no.
That would be good clickbait. That'd be good.
That'd be terrible. No, you can't put that. They would kill me. But yeah, I think it was August and September. I had 10,000 for both those months, and that was just crazy to me because again, like I went from 2,000 for 12 months of episodes to 10,000 within 4 weeks. And people always said that the growth was exponential, and I didn't know. I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Consistency and exponential growth were the two biggest things, and it really is true. If you're consistently putting out episodes and every single week, you're elevating your content, and you want your episode to be better quality, whether it's the interview or the sound quality or the editing than the week before, people notice and they share and they keep listening and they come back, and so it really does pay off. But yeah.
Wow. That's yeah. I think we're about at where that first step was. You said like 2,000 total. I think we just hit 2,000 total, which is honestly a big milestone for us.
How long have you been podcasting for?
Yeah, Carlos and I think we did our first interview. Like, so I'm starting it at when we started like verified. Like January was when I started the Shane Show, but it was like 20 total listens, right?
Yeah.
Our first interview I think was in like April, right?
Yeah, it was in April.
So it was like a big quarantine. Yeah, so
you're already like 10 months ahead of me for my first 2,000.
Right.
No, I think my first month when I look on Anchor, it was like 3 listens for 30 days. Like it was so bad.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Anchor's a grind for sure. I remember it being in January. It's like I'm gonna put out one episode. It's gonna be 2 minutes long, and I'm gonna get 1 million listens right off the bat. Everyone's gonna love me. And sadly, it that fell flat. But anyway, moving
Yeah,
back.
no, I was a little
Oh,
bit
yeah, sorry.
disappointed because Anchor does their whole like sponsor thing.
Mhm.
I've only ever gotten an Anchor sponsorship. They're like hype this whole thing up. I was like, I'm
Mhm.
getting the freaking listens, and no one wants to pay to like say things on my podcast. Which,
Right.
of course, I understand. I'm a small podcast compared to everyone else, but like,
Mhm.
wouldn't it be fun to be able to make money off of all this like time-consuming editing? Like, that's the goal. But yeah,
Well,
I interned for a larger podcast, and she has over like 1 million downloads, and then averages I think like 100,000 a month. So like much bigger than mine, and so I get to
Wow.
have some insight into like what that ad kind
Mhm.
of thing looks like, and like what the sponsors and like the rates and stuff. But she also has a network do all the negotiations
Oh,
and stuff. But it's definitely helpful to see that like benchmark and know, okay, like once I get to this point, like this is when people would maybe be interested and stuff like that. But
mhm.
if you have the
Yeah.
audience, like it's definitely a marketable thing. Like podcasts, like I know from what I'm aware of, for a 30-second ad read, if you're getting 100,000 monthly listeners, people will pay like $1,000 for that ad slot.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're doing 3 to 4 ad slots per episode, then you could be making like $10,000 a month
Oh, it's
from
crazy.
talking into a microphone. Like I'm not even having that crazy. It's like you're not Joe Rogan, but you still can be making profit from it, which is awesome.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. Well, we can just make the entire podcast an ad, and then
All 10 minutes are just
all
10
10 minutes
ads.
are just ads. Yeah, it's fantastic. What could go wrong with that? But my question was going back to when you said that when you first started promoting it on Instagram. Do you remember like what that was like? What those emotions were like when you first put out like your first thing on Instagram? Like, what were you expecting people around you to like? What were you expecting their reactions to be?
My personal account or my podcast account?
Like when you started first plugging like your your podcast account on like your personal account, like
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
I mean, there was definitely fear. I knew that everyone that I really cared about what they thought already knew about it. My parents knew, my close
Mhm.
family members knew, my best friends from treatment knew, and then my really close friends from school knew as well. So I would have been much more scared if I hadn't talked to any of them. I was like, okay, the whole world's like, if I was launching from 0 listeners and announcing then, that would have probably been what I was experiencing. It was definitely anxiety for sure, but also like, what are people gonna say? Like, they're not gonna be
Right.
like, this is so terrible that you're trying to improve teen mental health. Like, how
Such a
dare you do
bad
like
person.
I know, like there was nothing they couldn't be like, this is because they're not doing that. They're not doing a podcast to try
Exactly.
and help it. Like
Exactly.
mhm. So I mean, I remember I had been dating this guy, and we like didn't end on very good terms, and he texted me and was like, "Congrats on the podcast. Like that's so cool." And I was like, "This is why." Like, no, no. There was definitely like moments like that where I was like, I wish I didn't tell anyone. Um and of course people will like make jokes about it and stuff and be like, "Can I come on the podcast?" And I'm like, "No,
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't." Yeah, but it's definitely fear, anxiety, and also a lot of pride because everyone had very positive reactions. Everyone was like, "This is amazing. Congratulations. Like, this is so cool. We're so proud of you for sharing." Like, my friends were like, "Finally, the world knows." Like, they were in on like the secret. And so it was a really positive experience overall. And I totally thought my listens would skyrocket. I was like, I tell my like
Mm.
900 Instagram followers, everyone's going to listen right now. I have 50 episodes. No one cares. Like you post something on your story or on your account, like we're like, oh, this is fun. Let me comment and a nice emoji. But like, it's not going to change anything. Like, at least for me, like my niche audience isn't the people that I know in real life. You know what I mean? Some people might find it helpful, or they might be like, this is interesting. But for the most part, it's people I don't know, and it's other teens that really are struggling with their mental health, their parents, or doctors, and all that kind of stuff. So
So what are some as you've yeah, I guess as your audience has grown and you've been doing this continuously, what are some cool opportunities that you've gained from doing this podcast?
I mean, the biggest one is definitely being able to connect with people like you guys across the country from all over the world that either want to share their stories or hear my story. And I think that's something I never would have gotten to do if it weren't for podcasting. That is definitely number one. I think um just being able to have that creative outlet. Like, I've always been an artistic person. I've always liked drawing or painting or whatever it is, but being able to and like media production, that kind of
Hmm.
stuff, but really just loving creating episodes and editing and then doing all the social media promotion and then getting a job where I get to do that. Like, that's awesome. And that's something I never would have been able to do if I hadn't taken the chance with my own podcast first and really done that learning curve of learning how to podcast. And it's a really marketable skill, especially in college when people are like, "Okay, how do I pay for things like this?" You have to get a job and stuff, but if you know how to podcast, if you know how to edit, like, people are very willing to pay you to either do their podcast from the ground up or just edit or just be a production assistant, whatever it is, and so I think that's something, that's also really cool that comes out of podcasting as well.
I know a few people who are struggling a little bit to kind of find things to be passionate about. And obviously, all three of us are very fortunate to have found like podcasting as an outlet and something that we all very enjoy doing a lot and find a lot of,
Yeah.
love enjoying it. And we're very fortunate in that sense. But a lot of people, podcasting is not their thing, or it's not related to something they'd be interested in. So, like, what would you recommend to other high school students, or or younger or older, who are kind of looking for something to do that'll fill these kind of empty gaps in their life?
Yeah, I mean, you have to try things. Like, people think their passion will just, like, happen upon them. They'll be, like,
Hmm.
inordinately motivated and good at it. Like, that's not how that works. When I first started podcasting, yeah, it was, like, kind of interesting, like, shiny new thing to edit these episodes and put them up. It's a skill and a passion that really grows over time. And so when I started the podcast, I took a break when I started my junior year because I wasn't super passionate about the content I was putting out, which was just talking about my own mental health story. And I like to say you can only talk about yourself so much
Hmm.
before it gets boring. And that was exactly what happened to me. I didn't have that platform where I wanted to share other people's stories and where I wanted to ask other people about what worked for them. And so it was really a skill in trying new things and dedicating time to that. And so I know for the longest time I wanted to be a doctor and I was like, I'm going to be a pediatric surgeon. Like, I love biology, I love chemistry. No. Like, I like science. I loved those classes at school, but it wasn't like I would get into that flow state of just loving what I was doing and losing track of time and really just getting a high from putting out episodes and editing and talking about mental health. And so you really just have to take that chance. You have to try new things and you have to be willing to dedicate a good amount of time and figure out, are you good at it? Do you like it? Are you motivated to keep doing it? And that goes for a lot of things, whether it's like sports or art or school itself or like writing, like anything. It's I think part of being passionate about something also comes with being good at it, and being good at it comes with dedicating time. And
Hmm.
so you just have to be willing to invest that time in yourself because it pays off in a huge way, not only from a professional standpoint, but from a mental health standpoint as well.
Kind of like a little circle, right? A little
Mhm.
circle. You get better, more passion equals more getting better, and
Yeah.
it's just a beautiful cycle.
And then
Yeah, and
hopefully it doesn't end. Hopefully, sometimes it does.
yeah, and I mean, it will end if you're not really truly passionate about it. If you're going through the motions, but you don't love what you're doing, you'll feel exhausted and you'll feel unmotivated and you feel like you're doing it for someone else. And that's when you kind of have to step back and be like, it would be easy if this is what I loved and I knew this is what I wanted to do. And that would be great if I had that path set for myself, but you're not happy doing it and just accepting that. And that's okay. Like, we're still teenagers, we're still young. I would say abnormal to know what you want to do and to be
Yeah.
truly passionate at this age. And so it's totally okay if you don't know what you want to do. And that's why so many people go into college with an undecided major. And that's why you can have multiple majors and figure out what you want to do. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for figuring that out.
What's cool about
Hmm.
UNC though, I know UNC is
Yeah.
one of those places you can go undecided major,
Mhm.
right?
Hmm.
Mhm.
What are some other cool things that you've learned about that go in tandem with doing a podcast?
I think the biggest one is that people want to help you get better at podcasting. I don't know, I can't speak for other industries, but I know when I first started really diving into podcasting, I sent all these emails. I probably sent over 50 emails to all these different networks and different podcasters asking like if they would like sign me on their network or do a collaboration or work with me. And most like you probably won't get a lot of responses. Like one or two responses is good, And sometimes you won't get any, but people are willing to take 30 minutes to hop on a Zoom call and be like, these are what you want to do. This is how you figure out your mission statement. You really need to figure out this branding. A website is helpful, et cetera, and kind of giving you that advice because, again, going back to podcasting is such a diverse industry and there's so many different niches and so much room for all these different creators, which is why people are willing help you get better at it because it's not going to kind of encroach on their podcast in a way. So the biggest one is that people are willing to support you and help you navigate the industry. I think another huge skill that I've learned is kind of guest outreach, like pitching people and getting them on a podcast is hard. I
Yeah.
do that for my boss
It's a
like
little
every
awkward too.
yeah, every single week, whether it's people like Selena Gomez who's gonna pass over and over again, or other like smaller podcast creators. And so it's like learning how to create a short and meaningful pitch and understanding that people a lot of the times aren't interested or they're too busy. And still not getting discouraged by that. I know I have this one podcaster who offers mentorships, and I would literally kill to be her mentee. And she takes on like a lot of older people. She herself is like in her 20s or something. And I've sent her like 4 emails. I sent her DMs like every single week. She's never responded, but I like still want that. And so just understanding that it takes time and it takes persistence. And yeah, and I think just being willing to have someone say no and not let that completely discourage you. But again, I think the third thing, as far as what I've learned going along with podcasting and editing, is again going back to the question about finding your passion, is that it really does take time. It takes energy, and as you get better, you become more passionate about it.
My favorite segment of all these interviews that I bring up every single time is the future. I personally like answering questions about the future for me, but obviously that's not the goal of this. I want to talk about you, but before I do that, I just wanted to comment on what you were talking about like reaching out to other people and kind of like building a brand. Like that's so applicable everywhere. I mean, on a small scale where you're like building an image for yourself, like, you know, whether you're like at college, like, you know, and you're just like networking with people, that's another huge skill. I mean, it's all about like who you know, right? There's the saying is like, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? Like the very kind of cheesy saying. It's a very true statement. I mean, and these are things that you learn from podcasting that are just things that you'll be able to carry through.
And it sucks that that's how it works because when I've been thinking about a lot of these things through a college admissions perspective, and I know there's this other kid in the Bay Area, and his parents have spent $450,000 on launching his podcast since August. And they purchase all these guests to come on a show. They have someone create the website. They have someone else write the interviews. And they have someone graphic design and manage all the social media platforms. And like that, my parents would never. Like if I asked them that, they would like laugh in my face.
$450,000.
Because that's passion and dedication, and that will get you into college.
That's a little scary, though.
And so it's about who you know. And so he can buy these guests on his show and have this network to kind of play the college admission system. And so like it sucks that that's how the world works, and you can use it to your advantage by creating those relationships and creating those meaningful interactions. But yeah.
Ooh,
real quick,
that's not his podcast. That's his mommy's and daddy's money's podcast. That makes me, that irks me so much. That irks me.
Wait, okay. Now that you brought that up, now I'm curious. Okay, so $450,000 on launching a podcast. Now, my question would be, like, say if I were to have this kid on the show, my question to him would be, you know, does he actually enjoy doing it? Like, or are you just doing it because? Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
From an outsider perspective, I mean, I feel horrible saying this because it's so judgmental. I don't know him at all. I've heard it through like a long line of friends. So I would say no. It's just it's a way to buy an activity for your Common App and have something that you can show that is passion and drive and commitment. And maybe he really does love it, and his parents saw that from a really early point in the podcast and were willing to invest all that money. But you just don't know.
Yeah, because for me personally, it's not like It's like, I mean, I'm probably looking to go to like UNC, right? I mean, in state,
Mhm.
it's a lot easier than it's going to be for you because you're
Yeah.
out of state. Um, so, but yeah, for me, I feel like this podcast is more of like is going to be like a launching point for more of like a career rather than just to college. But I'm
Yeah.
sure that's
Yeah.
that's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, I think my podcast started as a random thing I would do on the side, and became so passionate about it, and it tied so closely with what I want to do, which is clinical psychology. So that is why it made such a powerful story for my college application. But if I was doing weekly episodes about like my favorite tea to drink, I would not put that in my college application. So like, it just really
Right.
depends on whether it shapes your story and it's a big part of your identity, or it's just something you enjoy doing. Like I enjoy reading, but I'm not going to put that in my activity section of the Common App because they're like,
Right.
okay,
They're
great,
like,
like this is
nice,
fun.
cool.
Yeah. So I think it just depends, but yeah.
All right, well, perfect. You kind of already introduced I mean, I don't know if there's much else to be said.
The future, right, Shay?
Yeah, so I don't know if you have much else to say. I'm sure we can dive deeper into that. But I guess, what do you want to do going forward? Like, how do you plan on? Do you want to stick with the podcast? Do you want to make it go as long as possible? Do you want to like maybe find a way? I know you mentioned clinical psychology, like finding a way to completely implement like clinical psychology into a podcast. Like, because right now you're talking about a lot about your own experiences interviewing people, but like finding a way to kind of completely intertwine those two things, or do you want to do something completely different? Maybe like become a chef or a pro reader, like you said. Maybe you'll start reading because that's you like reading. I don't know.
Yeah. So I've always said I want to keep doing the podcast after I go to college, and my biggest guiding principle when I release episodes is how would I feel if a college admissions director was listening to this episode.
Mm,
I discuss that a lot because I think it's such a good thing to remember, especially as a teenager, and it's a great way to check yourself and your morals and your boundaries as you're putting things on the internet, because the internet is forever, you know?
oh yeah.
So would you feel comfortable having someone that you look up to in an extreme way and is making a huge decision about your future? You feel comfortable with them listening to the content you're putting out? And so I think after I go to college, I have a little bit more freedom with the episodes I'm putting out, and having these really vulnerable and authentic discussions about mental health, and bringing on more controversial guests to talk about more intense topics. But I definitely plan to continue. I think I have tried to bring in as much education as possible with DBT and these different skills and stuff. But as I become much more proficient in the psychology field and that whole area of study, being able to bring those things to the podcast and talk about different tips from therapy that people can use in their daily lives, and talking to other professors and peers at college, and then graduate students, and then colleagues at some point. And so I think it's definitely there's a lot of room to grow in that area, and I have no idea what it's going to look like 5 years from now, but at this point I plan to continue.
You know the psychology podcast with Scott Barry Kaufman?
I've listened to it once or twice, but I'm definitely not a regular listener by any definition.
One of the big things that and it's a good segue too. One of the things that they kind of talk about, like on that podcast, is mindfulness, and how mindfulness can be applied to like CBT, DBT, and like just overall like habits that are really important for your mental health. And I don't want to open like the biggest can of worms here, because I bet there's so much you can say on it, and I would love to hear a lot of it. You can give like a brief definition of like what you think that aspect of like being mindful is, or your version of it, and then like how people can, especially kids our age, especially can apply that in their day-to-day lives, whether it be in school or in certain social situations.
Mhm. So mindfulness is a really interesting concept. It's staying present to the max. It's being fully engaged and observant, and again present in what you're doing. And so mindfulness is somewhat controversial in the field of dialectical behavioral therapy. It's such a big part of it that at one point dialectical behavioral therapy and DBT was viewed as like a cult of sorts, because people were so obsessed with this mindfulness, and they were preaching, and and it's not like there's nothing bad like going on, but it was just people would like they loved it. And so people were like, okay, like what's going on with that? But mindfulness is a really interesting concept because it is actually strongly advised against when you're severely struggling, whether it's with depression, anxiety, suicidality, panic disorder, PTSD. Staying mindful and sitting with your thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors can be really traumatic. Because if you're dealing with shame or self esteem issues, sitting in your thoughts means that you'll just be beating yourself up for the next 30
Mm-hmm.
minutes. If you're struggling and are severely suicidal, sitting with your thoughts leads you down a whole rabbit hole of getting yourself into a deeper, darker, terrible place. So, I was so anti-mindfulness for the longest time, not because I didn't believe in the principle of it, but it was so uncomfortable for me to sit in my present thoughts and emotions. And so more recently, I've been able to actually meditate and practice being mindful in the more like typical sense. But I feel like the skills that I used when I first started understanding mindfulness are much more applicable to the average teenager who isn't like loving wellness and like wanting to like change their life and become a Buddha. Not that I'm going to do that, but just like the more average teenager. So DBT has there's two different key skills in mindfulness, and they call them the neopod skills. And so it's a acronym, and pod stands for participate, observe, describe. And that's what you're doing when you're practicing mindfulness. You are 100% fully diving into the situation. If it's conversation, your thoughts aren't wandering, you're looking at the person, you are having engaged body language, you are there. Whether when you're observing, you are there in that situation and you are just focusing in on what's going on in the world around you. Sights, smells, feelings, emotions. You are just observing what you're doing and then describing. A really effective tool for people that struggle with anxiety or kind of racing thoughts and ADHD is just being like, okay, I'm sitting in my room right now in a blue chair, which I can feel, and I'm talking to a microphone using these non-judgmental ways of describing your situation so that you can stay present. And I kind of touched on it, but how you're doing these skills is the neo part of the skill, which is non-judgmentally, effectively, and one mindfully. So non-judgmentally means you don't use words like good or bad or effective, not effective, any of these words that have a connotation that could be perceived as negative or positive, you're staying away from. You're completely objectively describing the situation or observing it. And so effectively means that you're doing what works for you. And this is where I go back to when you're really suffering, it's not effective for you to be always in a state of mindfulness because that
Mm-hmm.
causes you a lot of unnecessary pain. So, what is effective in this situation? It's probably not effective when you're supposed to be doing a presentation to take 10 minutes to meditate and like do your like sound bowl practice. If that's like, no, like that's ridiculous. So maybe it's more effective to describe and observe the people in front of you and completely be present in the words you're saying in your presentation instead of observing your thoughts and your mind and getting wrapped up in that anxiety. And then one mindfully is again, you are doing one thing at a time, whether that's speaking, sitting, walking, having a discussion. You're not one half of your mind is thinking about an upcoming event and the other one is like focused on the situation. You're doing one thing at a time. And so all of this wraps up into a skill for me that was really crucial to me, which is called staying present. And this is like, it's not a skill in the DBT handbook, but it's one that when you get into DBT and you're practicing it regularly, it's like a pretty common thing. And so it's the idea that you're just sitting in the present moment. You're not future tripping and thinking about a week from now or a month from now or the implications of this conversation in this episode on like my pod, etc., etc. And so you are just sitting there. You're effectively non-judgmentally participating, observing, and describing in the experience. And I think these are all things that you can really easily do, whether it's you're waking up in the morning and you're just observing the light coming through your window and what it feels like to lay in your bed, or you're at school and you are non-judgmentally observing how you're reacting to taking a test. So you're not sitting there being like, I'm going to do so bad, like I'm terrible, I didn't study enough. Like, okay, this is the question that's in front of me on the paper. These are the steps I'm going to take to solve this problem, and I'm going to get an answer. Not if it's the
Mm-hmm.
right or the wrong answer, you're going to get an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a very easy, simplistic way to practice mindfulness that I think is super accessible to teenagers.
Yeah, and it must be pretty difficult. I mean, to be able to master the ability to kind of turn on and off that mindfulness switch. Like when you're feeling good, like when you're in a good state of mind, like you want to, be as mindful as possible. But then, when things aren't going good, which is perfectly fine to, be be in like depressive states, right? Having that ability to turn it off then and kind of reset, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why it's again a skill. We talk about repetition and going back and doing these things over and over again, and you get better. And also not avoiding that experience of depression, because if every single time
Right.
you're feeling sad, you're like, I'm not going to focus on being mindful or staying present, your emotions will just get stronger and more
Oh, yeah.
overwhelming, and you'll never work through them. So there is like sitting with the discomfort is such a powerful thing within therapy, within mental health, within the world. And so it just kind of is this effective? Because a lot of the time it will be effective for you to sit in discomfort, whether it's meeting a new person or taking a test or applying to colleges. Like that, those are uncomfortable experiences. It's effective because that's just how the world works. But if you're having like a full-blown panic attack and you like can't breathe, it's not going to be effective for you to be mindful of the thoughts going through your head to a really deep level, because that's just going to bring you more anxiety. So erring on the side of sitting with the discomfort, but also having that self-compassion for yourself and being like, okay, it's okay that I'm not able to be mindful right now, or I'm not able to sit with this, because I can revisit it later when I feel up to it. But yeah.
Feeling feelings is important.
True.
That's a big thing. I don't know. I don't know. This is also goes into like gender and stuff, but I don't know. Dudes, like guys have this strange notion that, I'm not speaking for all people, all guys, but you know, it's like this, like this like a norm that, I'm a man, like I don't have to feel things. Like, nah, yeah, you probably should. Like you don't want to be a robot.
And there's this really good book, I'm sure you guys have heard of it, called Untamed by Glennon Doyle. And the majority of the book is about her experience stepping out of the norms of being a woman, whether that's staying at home and being married to a man in a heteronormative relationship, working in the church, and like she comes out as being a lesbian, and she goes off and marries this other woman, and she becomes untamed from the typical expectations of society. And there's this one chapter which I loved where she was like, from day one, even before day one, I have been filling my daughter's lives with examples of powerful women and powerful role models, and telling them that they don't have to, when they are advocating and being powerful, that doesn't mean they're bossy, and that it's okay if people can't handle how empowered they are. And so she's been preparing them to not be impacted by these feminist or female expectations. And then she realizes that her son, she's been doing the exact opposite. She's gone along with society's expectations that men don't feel emotions, and somehow they should still connect with people, even though emotions is how we connect. So she like has this moment where she's like, I've been completely unfair to my son because I've gone out of my way to undo these societal expectations for my daughters. And I've done everything but that for my son. And so she kind of processes through that and asks him like what he needs from her to be able to and to have this space to feel and be human. And so it's definitely an amazing part of the book, and I highly recommend reading it for anyone listening. But yeah,
I've never heard of it, by the way. But
Yes.
now I
it was
have.
the biggest
Now I have to.
self-help book this summer.
Oh,
This summer,
okay.
it's
This summer.
new.
Yeah, she
Oh.
came out with it probably last year, maybe but this summer it was like a huge thing. Everyone was reading it. It was like the mom book club book.
Oh.
Yeah, no, she's
Who was the author?
She had another book called Glennon Doyle. She also had another book called Love Warrior, which I hadn't heard of, but this book I did read and it was really good. But yeah.
I think that's got to be your next interview guest.
Glenn, yeah, I think that
God, I
should be
wish.
doable. Yeah.
No, she's like, no. So the most recent podcast I've heard about her on has over 90 million downloads. So like this is not easy, like no big
No,
deal.
I figured she was a
Yeah,
very
yeah,
well-known person.
Yeah,
So.
I bet. That's that. Yeah.
It's not out of reach. No one's out of reach, please. No
Yeah,
one is too good to be on your podcast.
Exactly.
Well, I think it
we're all
depends.
people.
I think at some points, yes, but not forever. Because
Right.
everything's impermanent and that will change. But right now, I would say that's out of my podcast.
Fine, we'll just interview her then. She's going to be our next episode. We'll let you know.
I'll listen.
Hey, we just snagged her. Sorry, she's ours.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'd be
That
so
would be really
jealous. I
funny.
would be
Like
so
that'd be
sad.
really kind of effed up, but that'd be really funny.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. If you could
I'll
land
just
her,
send her
that would
like
be
I'll send her
amazing.
150 emails. All at the same time.
And her like biggest thing, she's always talking about unplugging. She doesn't answer texts, even
Oh,
from her
God.
friends and family members. To like, good luck with that one. But
Just
the
go
power
with
to
the
you.
good old passenger pigeon.
I have an owl. Yeah, I was about to say I have my
Yeah.
Harry Potter owl just sitting in
Yeah,
the room.
so
Love
that's
it.
an easy fix right there.
No problem.
I'm curious on, would you consider you doing this podcast as a type of therapy?
Totally. I think talking to anyone, even if it's to yourself with like a journal practice or a meditation practice, is extremely therapeutic because as humans, we need to communicate, we need to connect. Like that's what feeds our mental health. And so it's helpful for me to talk. That's, of course, amazing. But more than anything, it's kept me on track as far as my recovery because every single week I'm asking people, what was helpful for you? Tell me about your mental health journey. Tell me about these skills that changed your life and fed your happiness. And like, I can't help but trying them. Like, I would be such a hypocrite if I was like staying in bed for the other 24/7 of the week. Like, that would be
Yeah.
ridiculous. And so, I'm constantly growing from a wellness perspective from trying these things and having these conversations and pushing the boundaries of my beliefs about mental health. And then also one of the biggest parts of DBT, not the biggest parts, but a part of it is there's a skill called the ABC skill, and it's part of regulating your emotions. And the B stands for building mastery, and it's building mastery of a project, a subject, a skill, etc. And so it's the whole skill. Essentially, the idea is that when you have these low moments of your emotions, when you're having that depression or anxiety, you can't think the thought, I can't do anything, I have nothing in my life, because you have this skill that you've mastered. You're good at something and you're getting better at something. And you have that endorphin release when you're getting better at podcasting or doing a skill or a sport, whatever it is. But also when you have those low moments, you do have something going for you because you've invested this time into getting better at something. So that's definitely also a huge benefit of putting all this time into this skill.
Especially like amplified through social media, people are constantly portraying this part of themselves that's not necessarily completely true all the way. Like that's not how they are behind closed doors. You know, they are, you know, while they may be, you know, out partying or whatever, you know, it's not, they're not like that all the time. Whether or not they portray that or whether or not they try and show that persona, they're not like that all the time. Some of them are even like struggling with, like, as you said, like mental health things. So like, have you noticed that? And like, well, maybe something, I don't know, something unique to your school, I guess. I'm trying to think of just different things that I'll try hopefully think of while you're talking about this first thing. But yeah.
Yeah, so I have had a really unique high school experience. I have been to 3 high schools in essentially 3 years because we just started senior year. So 3 high schools. I took a semester leave during my freshman year, so I didn't even do school for half my freshman year. But yeah, so I'd say the biggest thing that I noticed as far as a difference in social media versus real life is the relationships. I notice people that will post photos together or celebrate these like friendships. It's not as authentic and genuine in person. They're having their conflicts, they're having their toxic back and forth and environments. And I think that's by far the biggest thing that I see is different from in person versus social media. And I think when I was at boarding school, like there wasn't, first of all, we weren't allowed to have phones, but there was also, you couldn't like put on a fake front on social media because you're living with these people. They see you at your best and they see you at your worst. And that was a blessing. And also, it was hard also. But I would say, especially starting at a new school, the biggest inconsistency I see with social media is the relationships and those dynamics for sure.
You went from California to Boston, and then what was the third place? Montana?
So I've been to 2 high schools in California. One of them was a pretty small private school, and it was like very learn by doing, project based. We didn't have grades. And then the school I'm at now is just a local public school, so much more typical.
Yeah.
And then in Montana, it was an all-girls therapeutic boarding school that only had 30 girls, and we lived 5 minutes away from Canada. It was the middle of nowhere. Don't go to Montana. Like live in the middle. Can't recommend.
Okay.
Freezing cold. Nothing to do. No, don't go. But I mean, as far as people, I think I met a lot of down. Getting up, and I know she's gonna whine. Let's see. Met very different people from all different parts of the country, and I think what was most impactful was that you can foster relationships with anyone, regardless of where they're from or what their family's like or their political beliefs to an extent. And I think, especially with the recent election, we've heard from all these different people about their different political views and where they are on that spectrum. And we've heard people say, okay, you can't discriminate between people over political views, but you can't discriminate if people don't believe in like basic human rights and stuff like this. We have all these different crazy things being thrown out there. And I think, I think the biggest thing is that you can foster really strong, genuine, authentic relationships regardless of where people are from. That human connection, those emotions, you can have that anywhere, and you I'll be right back. So yeah, you can have really impactful, strong relationships anywhere as long as you are open to those relationships and you're putting in the time, you're putting in the effort, you're spending time with these people, you're being vulnerable and sharing things about yourself, and you're being accepting of what they're sharing. And so I think that's been the biggest thing, is that I didn't have a ton of strong relationships at the beginning of my freshman year, and then at the beginning of when I started a new school junior year. And that definitely is reflective of the amount of effort that I was putting in and how open I was to having really strong relationships.
Sadie, do you want to plug any Instagram, personal Instagram, podcast, anything like that?
Yeah, so I never go on my personal Instagram, so you can follow my podcast Instagram at She Persisted Podcast. You can go to my website, shepersistedpodcast.com, to get all the information. You can listen to She Persisted on any of your podcast platforms.
Click whatever link is in the description because it'll be there. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you guys did enjoy and you want to follow us on whatever podcast listening platform you're currently on, that'd be greatly appreciated. You guys can check us out on Instagram. Our YouTube's called Verified Media. You can check us out on TikTok. Tune in next Friday for a brand new interview. Hope it'll probably be a good one, so you don't want to miss it.
Mom, go away. I'm recording a podcast. Recording a podcast.
Toodles!